Thanks for the Demon Soul spoilers, Richard.
I'm sorry for spoiling a 9-year-old game. Actually, if you weren't a scrub and you'd beaten Vanguard in the tutorial, you would already have met the Dragon God.
Are we doing this again?
I guess we can.
Are we going there again, Richard?
Oh, another thing to talk about that I never see mentioned, and I mentioned once in an Aegon video, and Redgrave said that's a good point, which I think is the first time he's acknowledged anything I've said.
What is it?
Was when the moon presence grabs you, if you take the 3/3 chords, there is this like weird reaction. It's like a sort of starburst thing, and she shoots backwards. That is the same kind of animation that plays at the start of the game when there's that like blood werewolf thing that tries touching you in your sleep. When that touches you, there's the same kind of like light effect, and it gets pushed backwards. So like, what I think happens is the messengers inoculate you against the scourge. That's why you don't turn into a beast unless you take the beast rune, beast's embrace. Like, you start the game sort of repelling the beast thing, and then you reach a point where you can repel the moon presence. So like you can now repel great ones as well.
That's a really good observation, Richard.
Do you want to talk about third chords? Because they're kind of fascinating.
Your definition of fascinating is a little different from mine.
We just use them to defeat the moon presence, so I guess they're relevant.
Yes, go on.
Third chords are not umbilical chords, but they're kind of referred to as such. They're like a weird sort of organ. This is a thing in Japanese culture, it's kind of common, which is that a child will keep their umbilical cord after they're born. They will dry it and keep it in a little box, and it's like a keepsake, and it represents the connection between the child and the mother.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be what's going on with the third chords, that like they represent the connection between the Great One and its child, because you only ever get them from a Great One's child.
Right.
So what's happening is, when you take these third chords, it's like the Great One is somehow attracted to them. That's why they work like Madman's knowledge and they work like Great One's wisdom. Because the Great Ones are sort of like circling these chord things. It's like there's a precedent for what a third chord is and how it works. That's why Great Ones are attracted to them, because it's representing the link between parent and child. Well, I thought it was interesting.
No, it's almost 2 a.m. and I'm trying to concentrate.
Yeah. So like there's a precedent in
Yeah.
Japanese culture for like a dried kept umbilical cord
Mm-hmm.
being representing like a kind of spiritual link between a mother and a child.
Right.
So that's why these third chord things that we find in the game that aren't technically umbilical cords, that's why like they can be used to call on Great Ones, because it's like, here is a part of your child.
Right, yeah, that's cool.
Here's the connection, yeah.
So are there 3 of them or just one separated into 3 or 4?
There's 4 of them.
So there's 4 1/3 umbilical cords.
Well, the problem is like, it's only called 1/3 umbilical cord in, I think, the American script, and in the European script, which is the one I've got, it's just called third chord.
Okay.
It's not called 1/3 of an umbilical cord.
It's like number 3? Like third?
Yeah, it's just called it's a third, and the
Yeah.
Japanese one is just like 3 chord. So it's not 1/3 of. I think they put 1/3 of a chord in to make it clear that you were supposed to take 3, but it's not 1/3 of a chord at all.
So it's 4 different chords?
Yeah, it's 4 different, like it's the equivalent of an umbilical cord for a Great One, and there's 4 of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. That clears up
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah. There's also there's like legends about navels in Japan about covering your belly button up.
About what?
Covering up your belly button.
Oh, go on.
There's a story about, it's a storm god, that during storms, if you don't have your belly button covered, he will like suck your spirit out through your belly button and you'll die. And I read this, and then I asked Mai about it, and she said she hadn't heard of it, but it sounded like plausible that it was that story in some places in Japan. That if you have a dried umbilical cord, when the monster tries to suck your soul out of your belly button, like the dried cord protects you because it thinks that's your belly button. It tries to suck it out of that instead.
Well, that makes sense with the moon presence then.
Yeah, exactly. It fits closely with what the moon presence does, where it's, yeah. The early descriptions of the cord, by which I mean like they're in the game. You just play the game unpatched and it says this. It says that the third chords are kept to ward off evil spirits. Like it says, use to gain insight or keep to ward off evil spirits. Like it's a trade-off. So the idea might have been originally that like you kept the umbilical cords instead of using them, and that's what triggered that ending.
Mm-hmm.
Because the moon presence would be like the cords would somehow protect you from the moon presence trying to suck your soul out or whatever.
Cool. Well, that's really interesting.
That is Flora of the Moon.
Is that it?
I have a completely unrelated thing about Flora of the Moon.
Go on.
You know where the old workshop is, right? That's
Yes.
presumably where they summoned the moon presence.